Of course, there will always be opportunities for you to learn something new on the program every day. Now, let's go to our first commentary and talk about numbers for a moment. And these are numbers that are difficult to ignore. 15.8 trillion naira. Well, that's the figure. Finance Minister Taiwo Oyedele says that Nigeria saved between June 2023 and December 2025 from subsidies. Sounds like an enormous amount of money, and it is. But the interesting question for us this morning is not simply how much was saved. Nigerians need to understand what that saving actually means, where the money went, and perhaps most importantly, whether ordinary Nigerians have seen any benefit from the decision that made those savings possible. Marian, shall we break it down?
Yes, and I think that's where this conversation becomes really important, because when Nigerians hear 15.8 trillion naira saved from subsidies, the natural reaction is to imagine 15.8 trillion naira sitting somewhere in a government account waiting to be spent on roads, hospitals, schools, or maybe put directly into the pockets of Nigerians. But that isn't necessarily how fiscal savings work. What the government has essentially done is remove a very expensive obligation from its books. The question then becomes, what has replaced that obligation, and how has the fiscal space created by the reform been used?
All right. Before we even get to where the money has gone, let's remind ourselves for a moment of how expensive the subsidy regime had become. It wasn't a small government program that was costing a few hundred billions of naira here and there. Now, between 2006 and 2019, the federal government said Nigeria spent 10.41 trillion naira on fuel subsidy. That's an average of roughly 744 billion naira every year over that period. And then, after the subsidy regime was reintroduced in a different form, the numbers became even more dramatic. Now, take a look at 2021 and 2022 alone. NMBC data showed that about 1.43 trillion was deducted for petrol subsidy in 2021. And then in 2022, the figure jumped to about 4.39 trillion. That was during a period when global crude prices were rising, the naira was under pressure, and the difference between the actual cost of bringing petrol into Nigeria and the regulated pump price was becoming enormous. So government was effectively paying the difference to keep petrol cheaper at the pump. But I mean, Marian, you're looking at this, 2006 to 2019, 10.14 trillion. 2021 alone, 1.4 trillion. 2022 alone, 4.39 trillion naira.
I mean, the maths is together, which means you have to ask yourself, what are the maths, what are the calculations, what the country was giving up for in order to keep that price low. If billions of naira are being used to subsidize petrol, that is money that cannot simultaneously be used for another purpose. You cannot spend the same naira twice. The argument from successive governments was that the subsidy was becoming physically unsustainable, and that the money could be put in better use if the subsidy was removed. And now, the first official announcement from the president in 2023 when he got into power was subsidies gone. But that moment shaped the lives of Nigerians. It changed the trajectory. It changed how Nigerians thought, how they bought. There's a bit of panic at the time, but there's another side to that argument, and that is where Nigerians have every right to be skeptical. Because for the ordinary person, subsidy removal was not an abstract fiscal policy. It immediately changed the cost of living. Petrol prices rose sharply. Transportation became more expensive. The cost of moving food from farms to the market increased. Businesses that depended on generators faced higher operating costs, and those costs eventually fed into the prices people were paying for everyday goods and services.
Exactly. Now, the World Bank, when it assessed the reform in 2023, acknowledged that removing the petrol subsidy would create significant short-term pain. It estimated the reform could produce about 2 trillion naira in fiscal savings in 2023 and more than 11 trillion by the end of 2025. But the same World Bank also warned that compensating transfers would be necessary to protect poor and vulnerable households from the immediate removal or the immediate impact of higher petrol prices. And it's a very important point because it tells us that even before this latest 15.8 trillion figure from Oyedele, the expectation was already that subsidy removal will create a large fiscal saving, but the policy was never supposed to be judged only by how much government saved. It was also supposed to be judged and assessed by what happened to the people who were hit by the removal. And I mean, this is perhaps where the debate becomes uncomfortable, because you can have a government that says, look, we've saved a good amount of money, trillions of naira. But there's a worker, a Nigerian, who says, my transport fare has doubled. You can say government finances have improved, while a family says food has become unaffordable. Both statements can be true at the same time. And in fact, we're going to take you to the moment where all of this was being announced by the Minister of Finance, Taiwo Oyedele, as captured by our correspondent, Belema Ikiriko.
I have just two questions. One is, when someone gives a scorecard, how would you rate yourself out of 10? And I have just two questions. One is, when someone gives a scorecard, how would you...
The federal government says the reform journey is still a work in progress. The Nigeria Reform Scorecard is designed to give a clearer picture of where the country stands, not only in terms of the gains recorded, but also the costs Nigerians have had to bear and the potential economic problems the reforms have helped to prevent.
What we're discussing today runs in 4 parts. The first is a full account of how the resources were raised and spent. The second sets out, in plain terms, 10 ways these reforms have benefited average Nigerians and 10 harms they prevented.
The scorecard provides 25 indicators, covering areas including government revenue, expenditure, economic growth, debt, inflation, and the broader impact of the reforms. The Ministry of Finance says the full report, including the underlying figures and details of how government resources were generated, will be made available to the public.
And this reform is actually about the average Nigerian.
The Minister of Budget and Economic Planning, Abubakar Bagudu, explained the government's position on the reforms and what they expected to achieve.
In addition to all that he said, federal government was deliberate in ensuring that all the claims and obligations by the states and nationals were being paid as much as possible, to the extent that the fiscal condition of the state is much, much better.
Another key area highlighted at the briefing was debt transparency, with the Director General of the Debt Management Office, Patience Oniha, explained effort at clearer reporting and accountability in managing public debt.
Terms and conditions are presented to the Federal Executive Council as well as the National Assembly, so it's not just a blanket approval. Approved. The detailed terms and conditions are presented. And as the Minister said, the approvals by the National Assembly in the 2 chambers are plenary, so they are all over in the media. Everybody knows what has happened on that day. So there's full disclosure.
The government says the scorecard is intended to provide a transparent assessment of the reform process and allow Nigerians to track progress using measurable indicators. From Ministry of Finance in Abuja, Belema Ikiriko, Arabian News.
That's right. Now, think about it this way. If you used to spend about 100 naira every month paying somebody's bill, and you stop paying that bill, you have created a saving of 100 naira. But if, at the same time, your rent increases, your electricity bill goes up, and your debt repayment becomes more expensive, you may not actually have 100 naira sitting in your pocket or in your bank at the end of the month. The saving is real, but the overall financial position depends on what happened to the other expenses. So you stop giving your niece, your nephew, your brother, your gate man, that goodwill, act of goodwill you've been doing, 100 naira, you stopped it. In other words, you're saving 100 naira. But guess what? The same time you stopped giving out that money, something else took the money. The increase in the petrol you bought in your generator took it. Or maybe the lights, the electricity, it went up. Or maybe the transport fare to the office or to the business place went up. So Do you still have the 100 naira saved in the account that you stopped giving to Modupe? If your name is Modupe, I apologize, but yeah. But now, that analogy is actually quite useful for us at this moment and for Nigeria, because government has had other very large financial pressures. Debt servicing has become much more expensive. Government salaries have increased following the new minimum wage. And the government is also funding programs such as the student loans, the social interventions. And so when the government says subsidy savings have been used, Nigerians should ask for the complete accounting. How much was saved? How much was spent elsewhere? And on what? And can you show us what you use the money from the subsidy for? I mean, right now, the president also gave directives to say the funds, all of those recovered funds, should be given to NEL fund to also fund the student loans and all that, right? So if there was a clampdown on maybe a Yahoo guy, or you withdraw money, especially Aisha Achimogu's case, all of those monies now from the EFCC gets, and put them to NEL fund for better use for the people of Nigeria.
And in fact, Marian, there's a historical lesson as well, because this is not the first time that fuel subsidy was removed. Of course, in 2012, Goodluck Jonathan tried it. There was the Occupy Nigeria protest. In 2020, there was another attempt again, before eventually it appears this one was announced and then it stuck. There's going to be a lot of attention as to what we do with what has been saved. And more importantly, I think this one is more, the most important one. When will Nigerians begin to feel the benefits? That's the conversation we should continue having, because subsidy removal may have changed the government books. The real question is whether it will eventually change the lives of Nigerians. Well, that is where the success or failure of this reform will ultimately be judged. We'll give it a rest for now, but like we said, it's a continuing conversation.